Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode on Fit as a Fiddle. Our guest today is Jen Buice. She has been supporting families as a childbirth educator, a lactation counselor, and a birth doula for 15 years in New York City. And Jen and I have connected in the past through various kind of different prenatal, postpartum, and birth space communities and support groups and things like that. So we're really excited for Jen to share her journey, her story, and then talk about the amazing things surrounding birth, but specifically on evidence-based birth, which I'm sure a lot of people might have maybe heard a little bit about or maybe not at all. So here we are today to talk about it a bit more. So welcome to the show, Jen.
Thank you, Sneha. Nice to be here talking with you.
Yeah. So we'll get started with you just kind of diving into the work that you do, what brought you into the space, and why you support families for 15 years in New York City.
Well, like many people, though not all, I came to this work, to birth work, after the births of my children. And so this was a career shift. Birth was something I didn't think very much about until I was quite pregnant with my first daughter, my first child. And I started learning about birth pretty late in the game after going for a walk with a neighbor who had had her baby and was telling me her whole story about her birth and the people that helped her to bring her baby into the world. And it was a beautiful story. And I went to talk to my care provider about it. I was going to be giving birth in the same hospital as her and was hoping to give birth in the birthing center there at the time. And the answers that I got from my care provider, my OB, when I started asking some of the questions and started talking about the kinds of things I'd heard from this neighbor, just basically made me realize she wasn't really listening to me. And while she was a lovely person, I saw that maybe I wasn't going to get the kind of birth that I was hoping for and envisioning, or the kind of care, at least during my birth, because nobody really knows what exactly will happen during their birth. So I made a shift very late in the game and switched providers and joined a midwifery group. And this was all in New York City. And I was very lucky to be able to switch to a group pretty late in the game. And I loved them and ended up having my second child with them as well. Hired a doula, which at that time I did not know much about at all, but learned everything from this particular neighbor. And then after my daughter was born, went on to learn a lot more about birth in the next 3 years before I had my son. And after the birth of my son, it was a very inspiring birth. And I had learned more about birth at the time, knew that we weren't going to have more children probably, and we didn't, but not ready to leave birth behind because I was fascinated by it by then. So I was already in education, and so teaching and all of this was sort of something I was interested in, but I wasn't quite sure how I could apply that into birth. So I ended up doing a birth doula training. Those initial 3 days were mind-opening. I realized this is what I would like to do. So I slowly at first, and then dove into this career shift, worked as a birth doula for about 7 years. And then my kids were about 8 and 11 by the time it seemed it got harder to be leaving in the middle of the night for births, when so many do happen in the middle of the night. And as they got older, and so I started making a shift to teaching childbirth ed. I got certified to teach through Lamaze and worked with Birthday Presents, the organization that I had done my doula training with, and started teaching classes. And so I've been doing that for about 8 years now. And then within that childbirth, and during that time, I also became certified as a breastfeeding counselor, and I also did postpartum doula training. So I did some other trainings that could help me to do work that wasn't always just on call, which got harder with my children. But then it was just about 3 years ago that or probably about 5 years ago, that I started using the evidence-based birth website more, learning more about that resource. And then about 3 years ago, did the instructor training through evidence-based birth, and then also the additional childbirth course training, which you then have to do in addition to the instructor training to teach the evidence-based birth course. And I started teaching evidence-based birth classes in addition to the classes that I teach through Birthday Presents and Boober. And I love teaching them. I'm in the middle of one of those courses right now with a group, and I love all the questions that they bring. And we can talk about that more later, and how evidence-based birth works, or now, whenever you would like to. But that's basically the way that I got into this work, was through my own experiences of having children and my own birth experiences with care providers, and sort of realizing how incredibly important that choice of provider is, and that it really is your choice. And it's something, you're hiring this person to be there for one of the most important moments in your life.
That's amazing. I wanted to ask you, while you were just speaking about the birth of your own two children, and you said the birth of your son was very inspirational. And I was just curious, could you mind sharing with us maybe how you found that inspirational, or what specifically kind of sparked your interest?
Yeah, I think because I had learned more about birth through my own reading and research at that point, plus having had an experience already of being in labor and knowing a little bit more about what to expect. And the second time around, really understanding more about how my body works, the physiology of labor, how my body works, and how my baby inside, the hormones running through both of us, how all of that comes together to facilitate the process of labor and birth. And understanding that, I think, really helped me to move into or dive into the experience, and sort of even appreciate, while it was happening, how amazing of a job my body was doing, and my baby inside me. So I think part of that was the education, and part of it was sometimes second labors are faster and easier, and in my case that happened to be the case. So it was very strong sensations that I was having, but I was at home with my husband, and we didn't call our doula until a little bit later, because once you've had a very long labor the first time, sometimes you don't realize that things can go much faster the second time. But while at home with my husband, and then later with my doula, I was able to move and make sounds and work with the things that were happening to my body in a way that was just really empowering. And so that time being at home, moving to the birth center where I birthed my baby, and the actual birth, once we were there, it was all very, very smooth, very beautiful, very much felt like my body and my baby were being allowed to do what we needed to do to make this happen with no outside pressures.
That's incredible. And it's a blessing. I'm so happy that you have experienced that, because I'm sure that you probably just like remember so much of, even if it's not like for minute by minute, the feeling and the emotion behind it all. And you, I'm sure, apply it to all of your teachings, your courses, everything that you share as a birth doula, or shared as a birth doula, and now with all of your educational material. So I'm so happy you had that experience, and that you're able to pull from your own story to shape other people's, and just give them this possibility of, hey, it might, and I'm sure you talk to people in this way as well, but you might have a very medically, involved birth, and that might be the right one for you, because that's how it needs to go. But then here's another way to look at it, and here's another way to think about it. And I guess my next question then is, how do you kind of communicate that to your patients who might come in with like a very, either come in being like, I don't know what I don't know, just tell me everything, or might come in to be like, this is like clearly what I feel like is going to be my version. And then you have to maybe, I don't know, make them think outside the box, or think of different ways of perceiving what birth is.
Yeah. I think that the most important thing to understand from the beginning, and learning about and preparing for childbirth, learning about childbirth, is the physiology of labor. And so just coming back to that and understanding how your body and your baby, and I keep coming back to this, but your body and your baby and your hormones are all working together. And I use visual aids to explain this, and I talk about it, and I give them lots of resources to be able to understand how that works so that they can see how strong their bodies are, and talking about this incredible muscle, the uterus and the cervix, and what is happening at each part of labor, and understanding fetal positioning. And so once you have an understanding of all of this, you can see, oh, this is normal. And the sensations that go along with labor are normal. And so part of that is also reconceptualizing or coming to think in a new way about the pain of labor. And I do not see pain as a negative thing, as a bad word. Some people choose to use different words and want to talk about, instead of contractions, talking about surges or waves, and that's great. You can use all different kinds of vocabulary, and vocabulary matters, and terminology will help you to feel a certain way about what's happening. So I completely applaud that. And I think that reconceptualizing pain and looking at, the pain with a purpose, the productive pain of labor, can help people to move away from fear and into comfort and confidence. So those are a lot of the things that I talk about right at the beginning to help people to understand, what is happening during labor in your body, and then understanding how all of the things that you can do, movement, hydration, setting up things the way that you would like them to be, can help you to be as calm and comfortable as possible during your labor. And even if you are to have an induction or a cesarean birth, and these are planned, and that there's going to be medical intervention, or if you are planning to have an epidural, and so that you're going to have that medical intervention, which comes along with various other ones, you can understand from the beginning what is going to happen, what do all of these things mean, how are they going to impact the physiology of labor, and how can I still have my values and choices respected by the people around me as I move through this process and bring my baby into the world.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to just introducing the whole concept of evidence-based birth. I mean, just from like a clinician, a physical therapist who studied so much science, like that's sometimes seen as the forefront of how we need to push forward our thinking and drive our communication. Is firstly, this needs to be driven by evidence. Like there needs to be some basis that all of this information is coming from, and then we can kind of combine that with what's going on with your body, what's going on with the baby, what's going on with people in the room. Let's talk about how to communicate, and kind of dig into those kind of the psychosocial aspects of things as well. But as long as it's all driven by the biology of birth, then the physiology of birth, then we can at least delve into this with more confidence. And I think the point that you brought up of it being productive pain being not thought of as necessarily maybe a negative thing, but that this is a fact of the way that contractions work and the physiology of how things happen, and being able to communicate that with patients. So I'd love for you to just introduce, like it's like a trademarked concept, or thing that evidence-based birth is way to approach this, but it's also something that as clinicians we think of throughout our work, throughout anything that we practice. So I'd love for you to explain how that works here in this space.
Yeah, I think that, in birth, in hospital births in particular, and this is true in many hospitals across the country, and in some settings more so than others, and some less so than others, there is a huge gap between what the evidence says about lots of medical things, but including what goes on during birth, and what actually happens, a gap between what the evidence says and what's happening in labor and delivery rooms. So the founder of evidence-based birth, Rebecca Decker, through her own birth experiences, came to see that it would be great to, and not only great, but important for the safety of birthing people everywhere to understand what the evidence says and make sure that the care you're receiving is evidence-based. So, the organization, or Evidence-Based Birth, seeks to provide birthing families access to safe and respectful, evidence-based, empowering care. And then, so there are lots of resources on the website. There are resources for birthing families and for birth professionals. And so lots of, a wealth of information, and helping frankly to protect families in a sphere where birth can be, going in to have your baby can be a dangerous thing. So I focus on the classes for parents, the childbirth classes, and helping them to find accurate information, both through the classes that I teach, but also how to seek out other resources and make sure that you're as informed as you can be going into this. And so a big part of that is focusing on providers and making sure that you have somebody who is going to listen to you, provide the evidence-based care, pay attention to what that evidence says about what is safe and what is not. And, when can labor arrest, which used to be called and still is in many places failure to progress, when that can even be said to be the case, and make sure that you understand, as somebody who's getting ready to have a baby, when there is actually a concern that needs to be addressed with a medical intervention, and when a medical intervention is being suggested that is not really medically necessary, but is just for convenience, or things have been going on too long in their opinion, rather than in a for a medical reason, so that birthing people and their partners can stand up and say, what are the benefits of this? What are the risks? What are the alternatives? And can we have more time for this? Can we get up and move around? Or we would like to get up and move around, not just can we, making sure that people understand how to work with their births without going straight to medical interventions that they may be trying to avoid, if not medically necessary. So it's a lot about, the course really covers what happens with your body, what's the physiology of what's going on during labor. How do you advocate for yourselves in medical situations? In this situation, how do you advocate for yourself if you're in a hospital for having your baby? And this is also important. I have a lot of home birth people in my classes, and it's also important for home birth people to understand what happens in a hospital setting, because just in case of transfer. So we do cover all of that in the class, whether you are planning a hospital birth, a home birth, or a birthing center birth. And so I think that advocacy piece. Oh, and then also, of course, we talk about all of the interventions so that people can understand what the interventions are when they arrive at their place of birth, if they're having hospital births. And then that advocacy piece of understanding the interventions and knowing what questions to ask so that they can decide, yes, this is for me, or no, it's not. I think that advocacy piece is super important, of course, but not in every childbirth class. And so that is something where evidence-based birth and many other, wonderful childbirth classes around the country are really doing such great things right now to help people to have that, empowerment, that confidence to say, and partners, to say, my partner is doing really well. Can we have more time? So.
Yeah. Well,
And the other thing, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just about that, the course, one thing that I really like about it is that that the students in the evidence-based birth course do they watch videos before each of the next classes. So they do video watching as homework and some practice on the birth ball and with various relaxation techniques, and then come into the sessions, the Zoom sessions. I've been doing it all on Zoom in the last couple of years. They come into the Zoom sessions and we have discussions. So on that material, rather than me trying to teach everything about the physiology of labor, the stages of labor, the interventions, they have learned about that on their own and then come to ask questions and have, give their feedback. And so it becomes much more of a mentoring session rather than just teaching. And I really like that. And I get good feedback from people about that.
Great. Well, the thing that I was going to ask is that, do you typically see that people come into the session with their partners? Is that very, very common? Is that something that I assume you encourage, or do people kind of typically just show up as the birthing individual themselves?
Yeah, I definitely encourage that. And that is what the course is modeled around. I mean, it's definitely aimed at partners and birthing people having this experience together, and partners really participating in the advocacy practice as well. And of course, the relaxation practices as well, that are either during class or both during class and on their own in between. So usually I would say just automatically partners and birthing people are there together. In the current class, for some reason, I have a few people where the partners haven't been able to make it. So I am talking more to birthing people. This is a class of six couples, and most of the conversations so far have been just with a couple of the partners present. But in general, it's people and their partners.
That's great. So Jen, what do you feel like when you're coming into those, more conversational pieces where you're discussing, people have watched the videos? What do you feel like is maybe the number one or two top things that people might come in and be like, I really thought otherwise, and this is something, like, by watching or learning something that you've just taught, it's really changed my mind or my viewpoint, or my assumptions or expectations prior coming into birth? Is there something like that you see like a pattern in, especially over the years? You've been doing this for so long, so I'm sure generationally you've seen things evolve a little bit, but I'm just curious to know if there's something very specific that seems like an outlier to everyone.
Yeah, I think the physiology of labor, frankly, is a big surprise to a lot of people, seeing in images and hearing about how the hormones of labor work, and about how your body and your baby and the baby inside you doing these particular cardinal movements that help the baby to find every little tiny space that you can open up inside your pelvis by moving or stretching or moving into a different position, walking around. That sort of relationship that happens between you and the baby as the baby is moving to be born, it comes as a surprise to many people. And it has, and I admit that I did not know about this in my first labor either. And I think understanding that really helps you to connect with what's going on inside your body. And it has made me realize that, we're all born. Why do so many of us not know about the way this actually happens? We know how we get pregnant, but why do we not know about how birth works until we are, 39 weeks pregnant or 32 weeks pregnant, whenever people start taking their classes, or not at all, and learn about it either after our babies are born or never. This is not a part of our education in this country, and I really think it should be. I believe that, as kids are learning about what happens with reproduction, they should also, older kids, they should also be learning about what's actually happening inside your body to make this beautiful and every day, every minute, every second, experience, to make it sort of clear to people how this works.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of fear in even, young people who are not at the point yet of having babies or getting pregnant, but of, oh, yikes, I don't want to do that. And understanding more about how it works can really remove some of that, I think, cultural fear about birth.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm on a parallel track. I mean, of course, I don't support people through like the birth itself, but as somebody who just works with birthing individuals and their personal physical journeys, I always get patients who will come to me postpartum who understand and how to move, how to pick up their babies, how to do basic functional activities, how to bring awareness to, different parts of their body and what's urinary incontinence. And oh my God, if I had just known about a few things. And they'll always say, I just wish, some of this was taught to me while I was pregnant. Like we didn't cover, like my OB didn't bring up at all. I didn't even know that I was getting stitched up when I was getting stitched up. And we're talking about scar tissue. They're like, scar tissue? What do you mean scar tissue? And I'm like, you had, from based on what I just spoke with your OB, seems like you had a 3rd-degree tear. And this is the reason why you might be experiencing this perineal pain. And they're like, oh, okay. That would have been nice to know that something like that even could happen. I didn't know I was going to rip through having this baby. So I think on a parallel track, I tell this sometimes to my patients, and I'm like, talk about the things that have happened, talk about your experiences. Let's normalize this whole piece of birth and the good, the bad, the ugly, like however you want to shape it and however you want to think about it is your choice. But the facts are the facts. And, the statistics on, things like dyspareunia and lower back pain and things that you're seeing me for, they're high, they're common, but again, they're not normal. And so if we just bring more awareness to these things ahead of time, you come into it with a lot more confidence. And I'm sure that you might have experienced that from your first birth and the second birth of your children. Like, maybe some of the experiences were the same-ish, but the way that you thought about it and the way that you perceived everything is what made one inspirational for you, right? So I think that's the same thing that I try to talk to even my younger patients. I'll be getting like a kid with an ankle sprain who's like 18 years old, and I'll just be talking my work, and then I'll say I'm a pelvic floor physical therapist, and they'll be like, what's that? And I'll be like, well, you see, there's a lot of things that can happen to your pelvis, just like to your ankle, because it still consists of ligaments and muscles and tendons and la da 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 da. And so things can still, be disrupted or have dysfunction that limits the way that you move. And so the same things at the pelvis. And then they'll be like, oh, okay, tell me more. And they'll be so curious because they've never heard about it. And so people coming into the birth space, I mean, it's such a huge event. And the best part is you go into it knowing that you're going into it for the most part, right? That you're pregnant and you have these 10 long months of this journey or however long. And so you can use that time to just empower yourself, which is why I love, love, love childbirth education. I love doulas. I love the education and the information that's put out there, because knowledge is power is such a cliche way of looking at it, but you feel so powerless at times when it comes to pregnancy itself, because so many things are just not in your control. But if you know that X, Y, Z things could happen, you automatically have this sensation of I don't want to say control in like a negative way at all, but in an empowering way, that you can then like look at your options and be like, okay, well, I know this is happening. And in the moment of all this excitement and everything that's going on, like, do I want this medical intervention? I've heard about this and how my body is responding to it. And you can just pull from this knowledge that you have and make decisions either on your own or with your partner, included the team that you're working with, and just have a better experience. And I think that's the way that I explain even to my patients when we're doing prenatal work for prevention. Like, there's nothing wrong. We don't have anything that's crazy, huge, problematic areas. But I tell them, it's just like if you were to foam roll and stretch before you went to run the marathon, you might still sprain your ankle. You might still get a fracture. You might still do something to your body, but you go in with a bit more confidence, and the likeliness of that happening reduces a bit. So that's the same thing with birth. You go in with more knowledge and anything could happen, but at least you feel like you've done your part. So that's usually the way that I try to look at it. And that's why we're talking about everything that we're talking about today. And for listeners, if any of this resonated with you, and whether you're pregnant or not pregnant, or you know somebody that's pregnant, just give them information and be like, hey, there's some cool classes that you can take. And did you know that there are people who actually support you in the room? And in many states, it's legal for you to, whether there's COVID or not COVID, there's a lot of laws that are passed to allow doulas or other support individuals to help you. You don't have to do this alone. And so, yeah, I just wanted to throw all that out there. But Jen, I'd love for you to kind of touch on how people can get in touch with you, and, you know, how can people find you and learn from you if they're interested in taking courses and they're somewhere along their pregnancy journey.
Yeah, well, first, I would just love to say absolutely on everything you just said. And the pelvic floor therapy part of it, that is definitely something that I teach and inform people about in my classes. I always encourage them to, you know, a lot of people have their insurance will cover pelvic floor, you know, therapy costs. So I encourage everybody to learn about this and to go for an appointment if possible during pregnancy. And that is something that in other countries is part of your postpartum care, and in this country is not. So you may go for your 6-week appointment and not even have pelvic health be part of that conversation or part of that check, as of course, you know, but I'm hoping your listeners, you know, will learn this as well, that having pelvic floor knowledge and, you know, working with a therapist can really help you before and after your birth. So thank you so much for all the work you do. Okay, so about how to reach me. So I do have a website, yourpreparedbirth.com, and at yourpreparedbirth on Instagram. And all of my information is there. I teach the evidence-based childbirth class ongoing. I also, and links for that are on my website. And I also teach in New York, both in person, Brooklyn, and in Lower Manhattan, both in person and on Zoom through Boober.
Amazing. And all of those links will be on the show notes for listeners, so you can check out Jen's work. Please follow Jen on Instagram. And if you guys have any questions or want to comment or want to bring up your own birth stories, please go for it on whatever platform you're listening to this or watching this. Talk about it to your friends, share the link, you know, tell people that there's a lot of information out there that they can gain, and it doesn't have to be scary, and they don't have to go into it just kind of blindly following orders from one person. That you have so much that you can learn and go into it with so much more confidence. So thank you so much, Jen, for your time today and for all of the work that you're doing supporting families for so many years.
Thank you, Sneha, and for all of your work as well, and for having me here.